Before I begin this afternoon, I would like to thank Tom and Pam for inviting us to your program. We've been really looking forward to doing this, actually. We've been talking about Longwood off and on for many times, talking about how it's changed and remembering the past. But today gives us a chance to kind of brag about it and tell you what type of city you had back in, let's say, the 50s, the 60s, and 70s. This talk is not going to be about buildings. It's not going to be about how old they are or what was in them. I'm solely going to talk about, we're solely going to talk about the community and the people that inhabited Longwood. The ones that are buried over in the Longwood Cemetery. And I have to admit that about 98% of them are over there right now. So whatever we say, nobody can dispute. And I'm talking to Kathy, my wife Judy. I said, you know, it's kind of like a little gossip session we're going to have. We'll let you know the nice, warm people that lived in this community during this period of time. First of all, a little bit, going back a little bit of history, Longwood was tiny. In 1950, there were 717 people living in the city of Longwood. Then it grew in 1960 to 1,600. Today, Longwood has about 16,000. So you can see over that period of time how this place has grown. Seminole County, likewise, back in 1950, had a population of 26,000 people. That's all. Then in 1960, we grew to 54,000. And today, 2023, we're at 500,000. So you can see how a little place like Longwood has just all of a sudden just blossomed. And I guess if there was enough property, it would get bigger and bigger, like Orlando that pulls in everybody down to Osceola County. Anyway, going back to Longwood, the people I'm going to talk about are their names and their lives were passed on to me through my grandmother, Mrs. Hallie Levine, who lived across the street, and my father and mother out in Greater Milwee. My mother was born in Orlando, but came to Longwood in 1917. At that point, her father, George, took the old house, which had been one of the original homes in Longwood. It was a millinery cottage. Took and remodeled it and made it look what it looks like today. Back in the 50s, interesting note, when we were trying to update and try to fix the foundation, the old house foundation was cypress logs. Big old huge cypress logs they pulled out from under, and then of course put the concrete to reinforce the house. So I've seen a lot that goes on in Longwood, and the stories I'm going to tell you really has to do with just this immediate area. I know I'm not going across the railroad because that really becomes the late 60s, middle 60s. I'd love to share with you the names, the people, families that lived over there. But I'm just going to stick to this immediate area, the historical area, and let you know a little bit about it. Okay, the other thing is, we're not historians. So please don't think I'm trying to throw something at you. It's the gospel. Remember, I'm hearing it sometimes secondhand, mostly from elderly people that told me their story of growing up. And because Kathy, both of us were very interested in the past, we took note. Now, I was talking to my brother today or yesterday, asking him about the old timers in Longwood. Well, you're looking at an old timer. There are very few of us left. In fact, we were counting, there's probably no more than 8 of us that are still alive that lived in this original area of Longwood. That shows you how times have changed. So, needless to say, let's get started. We've given you some handouts today, and one of the handouts is the picture of Longwood, the map. And I'm going to run down this map, and you're going to follow me along. I'm going to tell you what went on. Remember, the time frame is in the 50s, 60s, maybe some 40s, 30s, and 20s thrown in, and maybe some early 70s, but nothing past that. All right, Longwood. Back in 1950, 717 people. You you see the old hotel. Right across from the hotel, you see the outline of the building we're currently in, the Longwood Civic League. The Civic League, as you know, is made of women, ladies that wanted to better this town. I'm happy to say my grandmother was one of the charter members of the Longwood Civic League. When I was a child, you always snoop around old buildings and old places. My brother and I were snooping around this building, and we always like to crawl under things. So we crawled under this building. And believe it or not, over here I'm looking to the back, looking to the left-hand side, we found shutters. And there were wooden shutters, huge wooden shutters that had originally been placed on this building. Big old brown shutters. I don't know whatever happened to them. I told Pam one time about them, that the shutters were under this building. I guess they'd been there for decades. Moving on down, you see again the City Hall, or the Civic League, and this is also where the library was. The library, of course, is over here on the left-hand side I'm looking at. And it was just a little substantial library that you could go in and do research. They had a ton of old encyclopedias, and that was for computers, guys. So all we had were world books and Encyclopedia Britannicas. And of course, ours were from the 20s and 30s in Longwood. They weren't the newest ones. Back in the back of this building was a stage, a big stage right back there. And it had doors on both sides. One to the kitchen, one to the out to this porch. And I won't tell you the year, but when I graduated from kindergarten, I was on that stage back there. And I had many of a birthday party in this building here. So it shows you how old it is and that people still remember what it was like. Again, this building has been the city's center for many years. We were proud of this building. The thing that worried most of the people, though, they didn't like it when they shut off the doors and created the doors out from the sides. I know my parents thought it ruined the building because they enclosed the porch. And I'm so glad that you folks took the time and effort to make it look like what it is today. Thank you. All right, let's go with Longwood. Now we're going to leave this building. It's like for a walking tour. We're going to leave this building. We're going to go down here to 427 Ronald Reagan. Okay? The building next door to us was built in the 50s. And it was Cunningham, I believe, home. This is where Kathy lived, or her parents lived. Next door to that was a big two-story 1920s, we call them boom time buildings. The boom time building was a two-story gray stucco building, and that housed the Longwood Laundry. Now we had our own laundry, and people actually used it, and they had upstairs apartments. Next door to that was a little restaurant. It was yellow, but it was brick. They painted over the brick, and it was called the Cozy Corner. And you'd go in there, and you'd get your breakfast, lunch, or dinner. And several times, my brother and I were given money to get us out of the house, go down there and have dinner. Across from it was Johnson's IGA, or the Longwood Market. The Johnsons were wonderful people. Mr. and Miss Johnson and his son Buddy and his wife, they moved from North Carolina, and they were instrumental in taking over, making this grocery store. The store was developed by Mrs. Hunt, Mr. and Miss Hunt, who lived down the street. We were proud of it because it was the only grocery store around. In fact, there was one in Alabama called Super Value. But other than that, that was the only grocery store, unless you wanted to go to Maitland, to the Winn-Dixie, or to Winter Park, or Sanford. And that was it. Okay, the market had a meat market, which is very popular with the community and with the surrounding area. And Buddy and Mr. Johnson also went after, we call them the dog people, the people that came in the winter to raise dogs. We sold a lot of dog food, believe me. I had the opportunity and the pleasure to work for Mr. Johnson for about 3 years in my high school years, and it was a lot of fun. That's how I met a lot of these people. Okay, we're going to now follow through, and of course, between the Longwood Inn, which is called today, we always call it the hotel. You had the yard of the hotel, with the long sidewalk that went down to the highway. At the corner of Warren and 427, just over here, sat on the left-hand side a garage. It was a big old red tin building. It was called Inman's Garage. And you would pull up under the shade, under the cover of this old garage if you wanted gas. Later on, when Mr. Inman was working, he quit the gas and it solely became mechanical. Directly in the back of the building was a junkyard. And when I say junkyard, I mean it's where all the old cars, wrecked cars, were pulled in there. And Longwood complained, so Mr. Inman took tin siding, or tin roofing, and built a fence around it, painted it silver. Now that looked really nice. My folks about had a fit when that happened. They'd really be looking at old wrecked cars. Directly across the street from Inman's and on the hotel property was a little restaurant. We called it Mom's Corner. It was a beer garden, a little beer restaurant. Attached to it was a barber shop. The barber shop only opened in the evenings because the barber works in Orlando during the week. Surrounding this building, the little concrete building, was a grove of Australian pine trees. Big Australian pines. They're beautiful trees. And as kids, we'd get under these big Australian pines. And, you know, if you've been to South Florida, you know they're everywhere down there. But we had these beautiful trees found here in Longwood. A freeze in the late 50s killed them. And of course, then they had to cut them all down because that was the end of our Australian pines. In back of Inman's in the junkyard was a little house, and it was one of the original houses in Longwood. And during the period of time I lived, there was a family called Burnell there. The Burnells were from Maine. Mrs. Burnell. They would come down every winter and stay the winter at this little home. They kept it very nice, very clean. But the house actually sat on the sidewalk. It was really amazing. She had a stoop, and then you'd walk into their house. In the years that they stayed, Mr. Burnell built an airplane, a Piper Cub in the backyard. And for us kids, we thought that was really outstanding to see that. The thing about Mrs. Burnell that was really interesting was that her niece was actress June Allison. So we were always impressed with that, June Allison, saying that lived here in our neighborhood. Next door to the little place, and you can follow see the sign, was the DeRosa house. DeRosa house was owned by Willie and Willie DeRosa. They had two children, Pat and Paul. Before that, it was a rental, and people would come and live there mostly during the winter. Next to that was our home, Milwee Place, which currently stands. Next to Milwee Place was a large lot, and it's still open. And the large lot was not our property, but the property of the Niemeyers. Mrs. Niemeyer and Mr. Niemeyer were lovely people. Their home was well taken care of. I'm so proud to say, as you all know, that they're redoing it, I believe. And I'm really thrilled to see that because it was a showplace in its day. The yard, they had a massive yard running from our house to theirs. Mr. Niemeyer collected tropicals, and he had every type of tree you could think of. Tropical plants. In fact, we built a tree house and a tree called a Cuban apple, the sapodilia. And that was one of them. We had mulberries, we had every type of citrus you could think of. And midway in the property was a water tower, an old water tank. And when we were kids, we'd play around it because you could look down the pipe and you could see the water way down there. And one day we took a softball, my brother and myself, and dropped it down, and it got stuck. So there went our softball. But anyway, there was a water tower that sat over there. At the Niemeyer house, we were also amazed because on the back porch, the little back porch facing our house, was a system, or not a system, an old well. And they'd go from their kitchen and get the water from the well. The house was very well taken care of. It had the siding in the great living rooms, the bedrooms, and it was beautiful. Interesting story about that. The day Miss Niemeyer died, I remember. They brought her out, believe it or not, back then, when the hearse came to pick you up, they wouldn't bring you out like in a bag or a coffin. This was in a basket. It's like a picnic basket, a long picnic basket about the size of a table in here. I can remember them bringing Mrs. Niemeyer out of that and putting her in the hearse and driving off. The family that took over after Miss Niemeyer died, passed, the house went up for sale. We bought it. My father had it for about 3 years, made an apartment, 2 apartments out of it. They about drove him crazy. He said he'd never do another rental. And we were fortunate enough to sell it to a family called Hopkins that came from Hoboken, New Jersey. The Hopkins had 4 boys and a girl, and they lived there all their lives. Unfortunately, I believe the whole family's now gone. Now, directly in back of the hotel over here sat a park. And of course, the big park was what all us kids played in. There were no sidewalks in it, just trails. And then a big open area in the park. And in the middle were swing sets and I don't know, those teeter-totters, whatever they're called today. And there was also a grove. We had a grove over there. And along Warren Street, they had planted azaleas. And they even had a sprinkler system that when we had a drought, they turned the sprinkler systems on. And we thought that was really neat. They also had at the entrance one of the biggest pine trees I think I've ever seen. It was huge. And then, of course, the city took it over and built that City Hall and those other buildings. But anyway, we did have a beautiful natural park in Longwood. Going back to the hotel. Living by the hotel all these years, believe me, this place looks a million times better than what it looked like back in the 40s, 50s, 60s, meaning how it was kept up. Coming off the side of the hotel over by our home was the kitchen. It's since been torn down, but they had a big kitchen that came off of there. My grandmother told the story that during the 1920s, the showgirls or flappers, as they were called, would do their shows, and during the days, they would crawl out on the 2nd floor roof facing our home and sunbathe up there. Well, believe it or not, Longwood let them do it. And they didn't think anything of it. It was just girls trying to get a suntan, even back in that period of time. Another interesting story about the hotel. In 1927, my mother's 17th birthday, her father took her to the hotel for dinner. Also, during that period of time, they had a jazz band. And my mother and her father, my mother said that the happiest she ever was when she danced to Charleston with her father at the old hotel. After dinner, though, they got up, and my father let her go into this back room of the hotel facing us, and there was slot machines. And she said her father let her play the slots. And he said, by the way, back when she was growing up in the 20s, early 30s, there were slots everywhere in Longwood. The drugstore had slots. Every bar had a slot. It was the thing that Longwood had during that period of time. Now, let's go back to the intersection of Church Street and 427 down here. You'll see here, you'll see the little shopping area. Right across from the Longwood Market, there was Moon's department store, Moon's department store. It was a dry goods store. They carried everything you could possibly think of. The neat thing about this was that it had been the former Bank of Longwood during the 20s and 30s, but went under during the Depression, or before the Depression, I believe. In this building, they had the vault. Well, believe it or not, if you have one in trial and clothes, you went into the vault to change your clothes. And they had that big old door that was just shut. And back of you, go in there and you change your clothes and come out. Bill and Billy Moon were wonderful people. They lived down in the dog track. He had worked at Dixon and Ives department store in downtown Orlando, but then he moved out here to Longwood to open Moon's Dry Goods. Next door to Mr. Moon's was a drugstore. It was owned and run by Dr. McReynolds. McReynolds Pharmacy. He was an old gentleman, so he couldn't really fill prescriptions, but he had everything else that you wanted. Everything from BC powders to you know, nose drops to dye gel, or well, they didn't have that back then. But anyway, anything you wanted, they had. Lining the walls of the store today, I think it's a tobacco store. Lining the walls were cabinets with glass panes, and if you wanted something like you wanted an Alka-Seltzer, you'd ask Dr. Reynolds for an Alka-Seltzer. He'd walk over there, pull the pane, get up and shut it back. In this little drugstore was also a marble soda fountain. And out from the soda fountain sat about 4 or 5 bistro tables and chairs, wrought iron. And during the 40s, 30s, this is where the kids would go and get their milkshakes or their Cokes or whatever. During my time, he had gotten so old he couldn't do it. But again, all that material, all that furniture was still there. And I was so envious, always wanted to use that part of the drugstore to go to. The rest of the drugstore, top of the counters, full of candy, cigarettes, things like that people wanted. Next door to that was Hartley's. It was Hartley's feed store, feed and fertilizer. And we'd go there and we'd buy our fertilizer for the yard, for the citrus trees. And Mr. Hartley had a little grocery store next to it, next to that. And Mr. Hartley, the store wasn't open that much because he was a fisherman and a hunter. So he spent most of his time hunting and fishing, no time to the store. He spent, the people that really shopped there were the people that lived in North Longwood, off of Myrtle Lake Hills, that area. And just to show you how rural it was, they didn't have electricity back then. We made fun of them because they lived way so far out in the sticks. They had kerosene. Next door to that sat a candy store. Believe it or not, a little 20-story building on the street. A lady from Winter Park came out and opened up a candy store. And it wasn't big, but she made homemade chocolates there. Then you had the big open lot, I think it's still there. And then facing Warren Street was a 2-story building called Madden's Corner. Madden's Corner was a bar, another bar. Madden's Corner was made out of cedar. And it ran down the bar, you open up the door, and the bar ran from the front door to the end of the building. It was huge, big old wooden bar. During the 40s, they opened up a pool hall next to it. A concrete pool hall. Of course, I was too young to go in there, but I did go in there. I couldn't play pool, and it wasn't a restaurant. It was totally alcohol, a liquor bar. Okay, we're going to go back down Warren Street. So look at your map, and you'll see the Longwood Inn, and you'll see Warren Street. And we're going to come down to Wilma. Now, Wilma is where it's the intersection of Wilma and Warren, excuse me. Now I'm looking west on Warren. I don't know if you knew this, but at one time, Warren Street was the way you got to Santa Ana Springs. The road would come up here to 434 and then turn itself and go down Warren Street and then back on 434 to Longwood. Going down Warren Street, you had quite a few homes. One of the homes on Warren Street, the first one at Wilma and Warren, was a home where the Johns family lived. It was a rental, and currently part of the house is sitting down here by the police station. I think they want to move it to the cemetery or something like that. Next door to that was where the Wilson family lived. Now I love these people. They were from the north. Mrs. Wilson had polio. They were an elderly couple, but she taught piano. And everybody loved Mr. and Miss Wilson. He was a contractor, and he built the cottage, the garage apartment in back of the home, as well as the little one next to it that stands today. Then there was a lot. Next door to that sat, with currently a law office, sat Mrs. Minnick's. Now, Miss Minnick was really cute. She was a little lady, no more than 5 foot, a little widow, friendliest lady you'd ever want to meet. And she'd walk to the post office every day. The thing about Miss Minnick is that she carried a purse this big. A big old person who could never understand why Miss Minnie wouldn't carry anything else, but always this big purse. Always friendly, always speaking to us. And then, of course, you have where Judy Stalls is. That general area was the Baptist church. That was about one of the few churches in Longwood, other than the Episcopal and later a Church of God. But the Baptist church, my mother told me a story one time, and they were having a revival in the old church. It was a wooden church, and they had the minister, the revivalist, was speaking, and he was speaking at a tooth, a gold tooth, and it popped out of his head and landed in the offering. And she said when they sat there, they started laughing, and the man was so embarrassed he didn't know what to do. But she said there was the tooth in the money bowl that they passed around. So anyway, that was worn. On the opposite side sat those homes that are still there today. And down where the birthing center was a lady, an elderly lady. Her name was Miss Thompson. We always called it the Thompson House, and she lived there. Directly in back of her was where the Shaws lived. Now, the Shaws had 3 children that we were very close with. I think at one time it was a gift shop and a craft shop, and it's still standing today. Now, the building that I was really impressed with as a child was directly across the street from the park, or what is now the City Hall. And that was where the WPA in the 30s built a pavilion. The big pavilion, concrete on the floor, being supported by a big cypress tree, some milled here near Longwood, and a roof of tin. And they had huge tables, picnic tables that were built by the WPA. They would run about the length of two of these tables. And they had seats, and this is where so many activities took place in Longwood. Pardon me. Particularly, every year the volunteer department had a chicken dinner. And that was the big social event in Longwood every year. I know my wife still remembers that. She was around for that. But at this building, they also had, WPA had built 2 restrooms and had 2 great big stone fireplaces or grills. And they would grill the chicken out there, fry it out there. Now, just off of it was the shuffleboard courts. Longwood was noted for its shuffleboard courts in the 50s. In fact, as children, nobody was allowed to walk on the shuffleboard courts because the tourist club had really put in some beautiful courts. And looking at all of us in here, we're at the age that we try to tempt and get on those courts and play on them, but they would run us off. It was called the Tourist Club. And the Tourist Club would meet every winter, and at times there were hundreds of people that would go down there and play shuffleboard. And we thought, well, isn't that unique? Here's all these people playing with that shuffleboard. Directly across the street, of course, on Church Street, you had the Episcopal Church, and they had moved it several hundred feet from where it originally stood, where it is currently. Next door to it was a basketball court for the kids, and then next to that was a baseball stadium. And the baseball field was where the Little League played. Going on down Church Street, you make the turn onto Markham Woods, or Markham Road back then. And back there was the Little League field. And then off on both sides were groves. You had the Gladden Grove and you had the Prosser Groves, both old families and their homes. As you young men probably don't know, but in the olden days, the citrus groves always had a big old house, usually in the center of the grove, where the caretakers lived. And then going on out, you had, of course, the Cersei's home, as well as several other older homes out there on that lake. Mrs. Cersei were beautiful people, wonderful people. Mr. Cersei, I can remember when he was dying, my father took me as a little boy to visit him. And you'd walk into this home, I don't know if you've ever been in it, it had a magnificent stairway going up to the top floor. And it was scary to a little kid. And of course, we went and visited Mr. Cersei. And then there was Miss Cersei. After he passed, she bought herself a VW. Probably the first VW anybody had ever seen in Longwood. And Miss Cersei would drive a VW into town every day. And the neat thing about Miss Cersei though, and now this is what I was told, okay? She liked to take a nip or two as she drove into Longwood. And she had her little old flask, and she'd take her little nip, I guess just to get into Longwood. So anyway, going on back down Church Street, I forgot to tell you a story about one. Across from Moon's and the Cozy Corner was that Carhart's variety store. And it was on 5 and 10. And Mr. and Miss Carhart came down from either Kentucky or Tennessee. I really don't remember, but they had a store there at 5 and 9. And I can remember this, my brother told me last night, that when he was 8 years of age, he wanted a BB gun. My parents had refused to buy him a BB gun. Well, he goes down to Carhart's, and they work out a deal, Mr. and Miss Carhart, if he pays them $25 a week, they'll sell him a BB gun. And that boy worked forever to get a BB gun. But they were lovely people. Next door to Carhart's was the little Payne's Hardware. Nothing like a Home Depot, believe me, or a Lowe's. This was your typical small town hardware store that had brakes, hose, nails, roofing supplies, and that was about it. And Mr. Payne ran it. And he lived above it. It was a 2-story building, it's still there, but he had a big balcony out over the Church Street. And Mr. Payne had his bedroom out there. It was screened in with canvas shutters or shades. And he would sleep out there so he could see what was going on in Longwood. Well, the big news was that one night, or one early morning, Mr. Payne got up early and he looked out over toward the railroad track and he saw a flying saucer. Well, word spread through Longwood like wildfire that Payne had seen a flying saucer in Longwood, and this was the early 50s. Everybody went crazy. This was doing that scared then. Next door to Payne's was a little store. It was called Ted's Appliances. And in the appliance store, he sold Norwich appliances. Now, unfortunately, Ted was killed at the railroad track up here at Church and the railroad by the depot. The train hit him one afternoon, killed him. The railroad, by the way, folks, had been moved during my time, early years, about 50 yards from where it is now. It was closer, further away to Longwood. They had a depot. You'd ride up a big ramp. And as kids, we'd play on the ramp with our bikes. We thought it was really cool to do that. Next door to Moon's, by the way, were 2 little rooms. So they were rooms about the size of a closet. And in those rooms were where Winter Park Telephone put telephones, which were available to the teenagers in Longwood. And you would see on the evenings, you go down there and every teenager in Longwood would be waiting for their own little room to make a phone call. Because not everybody had phones, and if we did, it was all on party lines. So, one last thing, Mrs. Payne also was the postmistress of Longwood for over 50 years. She was a lovely, lovely lady. And during her years, the mail, they didn't have mail trucks or anything like that. Everybody went to the post office for their mail. The mail outgoing would be, of course, stamped by her, and then she would put it in a big canvas bag. They would walk it down to the railroad, hang it on a pole, and when the express came through, the Champion or whatever was going south to Orlando, it would rip off the mail bag and pull into the mail room of the train where it was sorted. Now, we brag about Sunrail, of course, how proud we are of that. But we had an original Sunrail here, believe it or not, 50 years before. In the late 40s, 50s, they had the local. The local ran from Sanford, Lake Mary, Longwood, Altamont, Maitland, Winter Park, and downtown Orlando. And people would actually, who lived here and worked in downtown Orlando, would board the train in the mornings, take it into Orlando, in the afternoons they'd ride the local back. So we had that way before anybody else. Now, keep going. I'm going to take you We're gonna go north on 427, okay? You're gonna go past Jessup Street, where the Italian restaurant is there, live the Norse, Levi and Rosebud, she was a beloved teacher at Lyman. On down with the Farinas, big Italian family, I mean, a lot of children. Then the next street was Florida Avenue, where the Jacksons lived. And next door to that, the back of them were the Walkers. They were really big Baptists. They worked very hard at the Baptist church. Across from them was the telephone company. You'll see the sign there where the telephone building was. And then next to it, back on the main road, was, of course, the Overstreet House, which is still standing, and the Hunt House. And then you had, at the corner, the Freeman House. The Freeman House today is the law office, I believe it's the law office. Before Nan Freeman lived there, it was owned by her uncle, Tom Jackson. And unfortunately, he killed himself there in the grove. Let's go back now, going toward Lyman on 434, Ronald Reagan. You had Inman's Garage, I told you about. Next, you see Barbecue. That was the Burmeister family. They were from Kentucky, and he had a barbecue place. Before that, it was called Lola's, and it was a drive-in for teenagers. The only thing is, there was no pavement around it. Kids just pulled in any way they wanted it to go. And before that, it was a citrus stand where they sold winter fruit to tourists coming down. And then across the street, you had the old water tower that sat there for many years. And then going down Bay Street, you had homes that are still there. Followed down to Wilma. Then if you take a left on Wilma, you see the little blue building. And that was the Longwood City Hall and one-room school. My mother went to school there. In fact, I got a report card I found from going to school at the old Longwood School. And then you had next door to it, on one side you had the Largett's home, large family, and across from it was Pinch's. Mr. Pinch and his daughter and grandson lived there. Mr. Pinch was really an unusual man. He wore a pith helmet everywhere he went, a big old white shirt, and big old khaki shorts that were down here to his knees, and he carried a staff. And we always wondered about Mr. Pinch, why would he dress like this? Because back in those days, guys, men didn't really wear that many shorts. It was mostly boys. So anyway, we found out later that Mr. Pinch had worked for the government. He had been, now we can't figure this out, whether he had worked in China or India, but he was a diplomat for the Foreign Service. Unusual man, very nice little man. In fact, all these people I mentioned were really God-fearing, honest people, good people. You cross the railroad. On the right-hand side was the Overstreet House, the new Overstreet House. And it was built in the design of a let's say prairie-style house, huge home. Across the street, at the corner of 434 and 427, sat Jean's, which was a big grocery automobile service station. Second floor was where the family lived above it. Had a big picture window there, look out over the road, see how big it went on Longwood. Across the street from this place, again on Ronald Reagan, at the corner was the music box. What's it? Dolly shop. And it was where they would teach music lessons as well as sell music instruments. It was a 1920s filling station. And it was designed kind of like the railroad station is in downtown Orlando, 1920s mission style. Next door to it had a big house that sat directly on the street. It was primarily used for people that come down during the season. Going on down East Lake Street, which is Ronald Reagan, across from Jean's at the Wells home. Mr. and Miss Wells, he was the principal lineman, and she was the teacher at Lyman. And then going on down, we had Main Street. The reason I'm bringing up Main Street, it was named because that's where so many people from the north lived. And they were wonderful people. They were our winter residents, and they were very active in the community. And there were also families from Ontario that lived there. And they had well-kept homes, and we would always look forward for those people to come down every winter. In fact, we look forward to our northerners because they added a lot to Longwood. It boosted the population several hundred. Going on down, I'm about finished now, and the cat is going to take over. We had the Bowles House, which is still standing. And where the Cuban restaurant is, there was a place, a home called where Slick Tyner lived. Slick and his wife were noted for the vegetable garden. Across 427, where those businesses are today, was a big open field where he grew winter, fall, and spring vegetables. And that's where everybody got their fresh vegetables during that period of time. I want you to remember that there were, of course, all around Longwood groves. You couldn't go anywhere without smelling the groves, particularly in February, March, when they bloomed. There was a better smelling place at Longwood. And then over at the deep south plant in Forest City, that air would come in where they were making the marmalades, and it smelled, it was the most wonderful smell you'd ever expect. I want to bring up one thing about the black residents, the residents of Longwood. There were very few black families here. I often question my family why we had so few black families compared to Altamont. They could never really give me an answer. The black families I remember, and we were pretty close to them, was the Zigglers that lived down where Winn-Dixie is today. And they had the old man, I swear that he could have been in the slave era. But Elijah Ziegler drove a tractor every day into town with a cart to get his mail. And then his little kids would reach up on the back of it and he'd haul us back toward our homes. There was also Stella and her family, and then poor old Marie, who lived in a shack where the current McDonald's is. Interesting thing, folks, and I don't know if you probably heard about it, but where they built the Farmer Pick and Save store, there was a black cemetery back in there. And during the time of the construction, they found bones. But it didn't stop Longwood, they just went on and built over it. But there was a cemetery back there, a black cemetery. Going down what is 434 then, you had another big black family. Now remember, there's groves on both sides. But on the right-hand side, going back toward 434, 427, was the Jones family, a very well-to-do family, large number of kids, wonderful family that kept the groves, and they had the groves of their own, but wonderful people to deal with. And of course, the little church that sat in that area, which is still there today. Then as times changed, more and more people came in, and it started growing a little bit, Longwood. The most exciting thing that happened was about 1960 when Hurricane Donna came through and literally went over Longwood, tore the place up, and school was out for about 3 weeks, flooded everything, except Longwood because we were high and dry, but had no electricity. And since most people were on pumps, the reason we had electricity is we were on the line with Johnson's store, and they kept the frozen food going for people. Now, I'm more or less taking you around the old Longwood and trying to give you a little bit about the folks that lived here. Kathy's going to pick it up and tell you about the rest of Longwood down to Lyman, the old Lyman High School. Thank you.